Dr. Ralph Nurnberger has taught at Georgetown University for 38 years. In 2003, he was named Professor of the Year by the Graduate School of Liberal Studies, and he received another award in 2005 for over 20 years of excellence in teaching. His most recent course at Georgetown was a graduate seminar on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Dr. Nurnberger's articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the Washington Times, Christian Science Monitor, the Miami Herald, the LA Times, Baltimore Sun, and numerous scholarly journals and magazines. In addition to his academic career, Dr. Nurnberger has served on Capitol Hill in the executive branch and has also spent 35 years in the field of government relations. His experience on Capitol Hill includes serving as the foreign policy assistant to former Senator James Pearson of Kansas, then as a professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In the executive branch, he served as special assistant to the administrator of the GSA, the General Services Administration, and later as director of congressional relations for the Bureau of Export Administration within the Department of Commerce. He served for over 8 years as legislative liaison for AIPAC, which, as you all know, is widely regarded as one of the finest foreign policy-oriented government relations organizations in Washington, D.C. In this capacity, he had direct contact with dozens of senators and members of Congress on issues related to the Middle East. Dr. Nurnberger was the first director of Builders for Peace, an organization established in 1993 with the encouragement of then Vice President Al Gore to support the Middle East peace process through economic and social development. In this capacity, he dealt with international leaders, including Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, then Foreign Minister Shimon Peres, and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, as well as American and international business and political leaders. He also spent 2 years as a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he directed the Congressional Relations Program. He is currently a senior partner in a Washington, D.C. government relations firm, Nurnberger & Associates, which was founded in 1994. He is affiliated with the firm Gray Global Advisors, which was founded by former House Majority Whip Bill Gray of Pennsylvania. Dr. Nurnberger received his BA from Queens College, where he was elected Phi Beta Kappa and captain of the varsity tennis team. He holds an MA from Columbia and a PhD from Georgetown. It is my honor to present our very distinguished guest, Dr. Ralph.
Today's topic, obviously, is the Roosevelt administration and the Holocaust. And the overall question that we have to ask, and I will ask it at the beginning and at the end, and only each one of you individually knows the answer to what it means for each one of you individually. And the question is, did the era's most prominent symbol of humanitarianism turn away from history's most compelling moral challenge? And that's the question that we have to try and address. And what's remarkable is, and I don't have time to go into this, but I would be delighted to in question and answer, how historians have changed in their interpretation of Roosevelt and the Holocaust. For the first 20 years or so after World War II ended, Roosevelt's involvement with Jews with the Holocaust was viewed as a good effort on the part of Roosevelt and the administration, that he tried to do as best as he could. Then in 1968, a book came out by Arthur Morse called While 6 Million Died. And that began a reevaluation of how Roosevelt and his administration handled the Holocaust. And a series of books, and again, I will gladly go into these in question and answers. It would take about 10 minutes or so, and I don't want to spend the time now. Historians grew ever more critical of Roosevelt and his handling of the Holocaust, particularly the two bookend items. The turning away of the SS St. Louis in 1939, and the question of whether Auschwitz and rail tracks could or should have been bombed in 1944. But there are so many other areas. And historians, the more they looked into it, the more Roosevelt looked worse and worse, until there was a reevaluation period that came in the late 1990s, early 2000 period, when people started questioning, well, maybe he wasn't quite so bad. And now, among most historians, Roosevelt is looking better again. And again, I'll gladly go into how various historians have looked at this, but it's a shift. So when I ask the question, did the era's most prominent symbol of humanitarianism turn away from history's most compelling moral challenge? The answer is how you want to answer it. There is no right answer. Some of you are going to come out of this talk saying, Roosevelt, terrible. Some of you are going to come out and say, now I understand it better. It wasn't as bad as I feared. Some will come out and say, I thought he was good and now I'm happy. So there is no correct answer, and historians differ. I'm going to mention very, very many dates in this talk. And I apologize for that. It's mostly historians view things chronologically, and by putting dates on, it makes it easier for people to understand. That said, there are only very few dates that are important for you to actually remember. And I will throw those out at the beginning. It's a remarkable coincidence that Roosevelt and Hitler came to power at exactly the same time and died almost exactly at the same time. Roosevelt was elected as president, in November of 1932, and in those days, inaugurations took place in March. It was actually Roosevelt who changed that to January later on, when he said, shifting from the Roosevelt administration to the Roosevelt administration, why have such a long transition period? And that's why we now have inaugurations in January. But in his first term, it was in March. So he's elected in November, and he is sworn in March. November of 1932, March of 1933. Hitler is elected in January of 1933, exactly between Roosevelt's election and Roosevelt's inauguration. Hitler is elected with only 30–35% of the German vote, but because of the way he's able to manipulate the parliament at the time, he becomes chancellor and obviously stays that for the rest of his life. Both Roosevelt and Hitler die in April of 1945. Roosevelt dies on April 12 of 1945. Hitler dies on April 30th of 1945. So basically, they overlap almost exactly for the period that we are looking at. The second date, the third date, 33, 35, 45, the only other date to really pay attention to is September 1939. Because in September 1939 was when the Nazis invaded Poland, thus beginning the Second World War. For our purposes, the topic that we're going to look at today is how Roosevelt dealt with Nazi Germany, not just the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust officially begins in 1942 at the Wannsee Conference. But obviously Jews are treated horrifically before the actual beginning, in quotes, of the Holocaust. And I'll point out a lot of that. For our purposes, the 1939 date is a very good halfway mark. Up to 1939, the issue that confronted the United States and the civilized world was immigration. How do you get Jews out of Germany and later Austria to get away from the Nazis? After World War II began, this shifted. And it shifted to the countries that the Nazis were able to conquer. Because the Jews in Germany and in Austria, it was difficult to get out, but it was not always impossible. The question was not getting out as much as where to go. And that's an immigration question. After 1939, in the countries which Germany conquered, both in East Europe and in West Europe, Holland, Belgium, France, Poland, Ukraine, etc., Hungary, Romania, those Jews were trapped. They didn't have the time to get out and to plan. So it's a totally different set of issues that we will look at. There are three major factors that Roosevelt had to deal with when he became president in 1933. The overall economy. Remember, he becomes president at the height of both domestic and world depression. And in the United States, the issue that really dominated more than anything else was unemployment. The second issue that he had to deal with was nativism. And the third was anti-Semitism. To go into each of these rather quickly. Opponents of immigration, and remember the issue that we first have to deal with is, can the Jews, if they get out, come somewhere? Come to the United States or get into other countries? Opponents of the immigration pointed out the high levels of unemployment in the United States and said because of the Depression, and asserted that any immigrants, Jewish or otherwise, who would come into this country would take jobs from people who are already here. And so there was a huge anti-immigrant, not anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant feeling in the country. Organized labor led protests against allowing any more people to come. During the war, when there was wartime prosperity and the war created new jobs, people still didn't want immigrants to come because they felt that when the war ends, soldiers would come back and there wouldn't be jobs for them. And also, you wouldn't be creating and building military equipment, so therefore there would be a decrease in military jobs, soldiers coming back, we don't need immigrants. So there is a huge, tremendous anti-immigration sentiment in the United States. Second, the issue of nativism. Nativism is the belief that this country was created only for 100% Americans. Polls indicated beginning in the 1930s until the late 1930s, anywhere between 70 and 85% of Americans objected to increased immigration quotas because they did not want other people to come into their country. By the mid-1930s, 2/3 of Americans registered in polls that they did not want any refugees coming in for humanitarian purposes or any other reason. This is a reason why, during the 1930s, literally hundreds of bills are introduced in Congress by Republicans and Democrats alike to prevent further immigration into this country. Third factor that Roosevelt found related to this issue when he became president was growing tremendous anti-Semitism. Now, a lot of the people who came to this country, or excuse me, who were in this country and opposed immigration, were not anti-Semites. But there were also a lot of anti-Semites who didn't want people coming into this country. There were over 100 registered or clearly identifiable anti-Semitic organizations in the country. The most famous, of course, was the Ku Klux Klan. But there were individuals who were spreading their hatred around the country. For example, Father Coughlin in Michigan. He cited Jewish bankers controlling the world economy and used his weekly program, which had a minimum audience estimated to be 20 million people, spewing forth his anti-Semitic hatred. Gerald Winrod, who was known as the Jayhawk Nazi, because he was based in Kansas, pledged to battle the hidden hand of the Jewish conspiracy to rule America. Gerald L.K. Smith, whose magazine, The Cross and the Flag, led to the formation of something called the America First Party, which was isolationist, anti-New Deal, and anti-Semitic. William Dudley Pele headed the Silver Shirts, and their one issue was the forcible removal of Jews from power in the United States. The Friends of Germany organization packed 20,000 people into Madison Square Garden on May 17, 1934, to commend Hitler for his views on Jews. One of the worst anti-Semites, Henry Ford. Henry Ford funded the publication of 500,000, 500,000 copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was distributed throughout the United States. The Protocols is an anti-Semitic hoax purporting to be a Jewish plan for global domination. It was first published in Russia in 1903. He knew it was a fraud. It had been clearly debunked by then, but he went on to publish it. He also published articles entitled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problems. With so many anti-Semites spewing forth their hatred, it is not surprising at the number of anti-Semitic acts of violence in the United States at the time, particularly in the 1930s. Vandalizing Jewish cemeteries, attacking synagogues, leaflets, pamphlets. During the 1930s, every single synagogue in Washington Heights, New York, was desecrated. Most were smeared with swastikas. In Boston in the 1930s, beatings and defilements became daily occurrences and attacks against Jews. It got worse when you looked at what was going on in Congress. There were a number of clear anti-Semites in the Congress. There were others who were just quiet and allowed the anti-Semites to do what they wish. And there were others who felt that there were so many anti-Semitic constituents that they weren't going to challenge the anti-Semites in Congress, who went on the floor of Congress to make anti-Semitic comments. For example, it is probable that statements by a congressman from Mississippi, a Democrat by the name of John Rankin, who regularly lashed out against Jews from the House of Representatives floor, caused the death of a congressman from New York, a Jewish congressman, also a Democrat, named Michael Edelstein, who collapsed and died of a heart attack on the floor of the House of Congress listening to this anti-Semitic dribble. So, essentially, from the start of the Roosevelt administration, there is anti-Semitism of a level that we have not seen in the United States before, and fortunately since. Be aware at the time the Jewish population in the United States was under 4%. And many who attacked Roosevelt referred to his proposals for the economy as the Jew deal. Anti-Semitism was particularly bad, and this is where the problem really grows within the State Department. And within the State Department, the key figure to pay attention to is Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long. If you have one figure that you want to yell boo and hiss at, this is the worst character we're going to come across in this talk. Breckinridge Long, before he became Assistant Secretary of State, grew up in Kentucky. His family was quite wealthy. They were horse breeders. Emanuel Seller, a congressman from Brooklyn, New York, some of you may remember his name. He served in Congress for 200, 300, 400 years. From Brooklyn, described Long as cold, austere, still as a poker, and a true anti-Semite. We'll come back to Seller and Long later. Long's diary was kept in secret until only a few years ago, and it became public a few years ago, which is when I had a chance to read it. In it, Long, the Assistant Secretary of State of the United States, praises Mein Kampf, especially Hitler's opposition to Jews and Jewry, whom he claims are exponents of communism and chaos. Long in his diary, and again, this is a relatively recent piece of information. I certainly didn't know about this when I first studied these matters. Said that the country is besieged by communist extreme radicals and Jewish professional agitators, refugee enthusiasts, and dirty other Jews. This is in his diary, so obviously it doesn't become public until recently. Significantly, while Assistant Secretary, and he is the guy who controls immigration, he writes the following memo that goes out to all consular officials throughout the United States, outreach throughout the world. Quote, "We can delay and effectively stop the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and require additional evidence to resort to various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas." In other words, the difficulty is you've got to have a quota number, and the quotas are limited. But if you get a quota, you go to a consular official, you show, I'm number 400 or I'm number 200 or whatever it is. Oh, what's your health like? How much money do you have? Whom do you know? How good is your English? Can you read this? And make it so difficult for people, even if they qualify, to not qualify. Long was not alone within the State Department. For example, another Assistant Secretary of State, Wilbur Carr, once wrote that he refuses to go to a particular hotel in Atlantic City because, quote, it's stinky Jewish atmosphere. Another Undersecretary of State, the number 2 at the State Department, William Phillips, described another diplomat as a perfect little rat of a Jew. All of these people felt comfortable at the State Department at the time, and remember, the State Department was responsible for many things, but in our discussion, 2 things. Relations with all of the countries in the world, obviously including Nazi Germany, and immigration matters. Now, it is important for us to remember that Roosevelt and the Roosevelt administration inherited immigration laws and quotas. They didn't write them. The immigration laws that the Roosevelt administration started with, or looked at, for the most part, were written during the Harding administration and enacted in 1921, after World War I. When the desire was to reduce or limit the number of people coming into the country. These were then tightened even more in 1924 by the Coolidge administration and tightened even more during the Hoover administration in 1930. Essentially, the laws established, and I'll leave this up for a while, there's no Blue Book exam, and don't worry about the exact numbers. But basically, it sets a maximum quota for people coming from individual countries. And so there was a list of every country in the world and how many people maximum could come from that country. What I put up here is the numbers from Germany. Now, that's not Jews from Germany, that's Germans. So the Jews trying to get into this country from Germany are obviously under the same quota as non-Jews trying to come in. The law stated that there would be a maximum of 25,957 German citizens per year admitted into the United States. For our purposes, 26,000, ballpark number. This number was increased to 27,370 when Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, in 1938. But in addition to the quotas, because of bureaucratic efforts to keep Jews out, the quotas were almost never met. So, for example, in 1933, only 5% of the quota was used. In 1934, 17% of the quota. In 1935, 20% of the quota. In 1936, 24% of the quota. In 1938, the number admitted was 64%, and the only year that the quota was met was in 1939. Basically, between 1933 and 1939, 190,000 quota spaces from Germany were unused. So efforts to raise the quota would have been helpful, but even more would have been helpful to ensure that the State Department and consular officials allowed people to use the quota numbers that were there. Once the war began, it became even more difficult for Jews to come into this country because, in particular, if they happen to have had relatives living in Germany. So, for example, you would be asked, okay, you have a quota number, you're welcome to come in, do you still have any relatives? Yeah, my aunt lives in Hamburg. Well, then you can't come, because if you come here, the Nazis are going to get your aunt, and unless you become a spy for them, they're going to kill them, so you're going to turn traitor. So it became more difficult once the war began, in addition, obviously, to getting across the ocean and all of that, because the fear that the people who were coming might be spies themselves, or because they had relatives in the old country, might wind up turning. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, his animus towards the Jews was, of course, well known. You don't have to be a genius if you can read German or an English translation. By the way, as an aside, the first English translation of Mein Kampf was done by a future United States Senator named Alan Cranston, who was then sued by Adolf Hitler for false translating of Mein Kampf. He always used to love to say, I was the only U.S. senator personally sued by Adolf Hitler. But you don't have to be a genius to see what the Nazis, not only Hitler, but the people around him, are doing and saying about the Jews. But yet there was no clear plan to slaughter Jews, although some saw this coming. News of the Nazi persecutions of Jews and comments against Jews were covered in American media at the time, carried by all newspapers, major newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, etc. For example, the New York Times reported in 1933 in September, quote, "Aryanism is the keystone of Nazi policy. Its corollary is persecution even to extermination. The word is the Nazis' own of non-Aryans." Now, of course, Jewish groups knew what was going on at the time, and on March 20th, so 2 months after Hitler comes to power in 1933, the American Jewish Committee and B'nai B'rith issued a joint statement expressing, quote, "the horror of the anti-Jewish actions in Germany," and called on the U.S. government to make proper representations to the government of Germany. They sent this to the State Department, where the response came from the Secretary of State himself, Cordell Hull. We'll meet him in a few minutes as well. So 6 days after receiving the petition, remember this is March 1933, 2 months after Hitler comes to power, Cordell Hull responds to the Jews by saying he was hopeful that Germany will soon revert to normal. He issues a statement: "I have reason to believe that many of the acts of terror and atrocities that have reached this country are exaggerated, and I fear that continued dissemination of exaggerated reports will prejudice the friendly feelings between the two peoples of our countries, Germany and the United States." Cordell Hull, 1933. The most politically active and significant Jewish leader at this time is Rabbi Stephen Wise. We will meet him repeatedly throughout this talk. On May 10, 1933, so just a few months after Hitler's assumption of power, Rabbi Wise puts together a major national protest against the anti-Jewish policies in Germany. They hold rallies, including a mock trial of Hitler in Madison Square Garden, where Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor, Al Smith, the former governor, and Rabbi Stephen Wise all testified. B'nai B'rith sends a petition to Roosevelt with 250,000 signatures protesting Germany's treatment of Jews. None of this accomplished very much. Basically, the Jewish organizations at the time were essentially paper tigers. The American Jewish Committee at the time had 350 members, and it lacked a grassroots constituency. The American Jewish Congress sponsored protests and rallies, but it had no Washington office, no lobbying capabilities. When I was a lobbyist at AIPAC and used to travel for them, speaking at events, trying to get people involved with AIPAC, I would make a point that in the 1930s there was no pro-Jewish, pro-Israel, obviously no pro-Israel, lobby in Washington. And the need for political action was brought out very clearly by the fact that it did not exist in the 1930s other than individuals acting on their own as much as they could. Roosevelt also felt that he could take the Jews for granted. He received in 1932, when he ran for the first time, just over 80% of the Jewish vote. When he ran for re-election in 1936, 1940, and 1944, he topped 90% of the Jewish vote. Jews in particular appreciated Roosevelt's social welfare programs, his support for ethnic minorities, and they were very impressed with the large number of significant Jews whom Roosevelt appointed to top-level positions in his administration and to other key positions. For example, his chief speechwriter was Samuel Rosenman, Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. He later, a little later on, appointed the second Supreme Court Chief Justice, not Chief Justice, Felix Frankfurter, and Brandeis was already on the court, appointed by Wilson. New Deal economic architect, Ben Cohen, and the list just goes on. And the number of Jewish friends that Roosevelt had. And so the Jewish community felt that they were comfortable with him, and they were willing to support him, deferring concerns about the fate of German Jews for a later time. In addition, Roosevelt received the support of the Jews because there was nowhere else to go. The Republican Party offered no alternative. At the time, the Republican Party was overly conservative, overly isolationist, extremely white, and Protestant. And it was backing, quote, traditional American values and rigid restrictions on immigration. And so the Jews did not feel that they had a home in the Republican Party, and so Roosevelt really didn't have to worry about the Jewish vote because there was nowhere else for them to go. Roosevelt also felt that his top priority, particularly in his first term, was fighting the Depression. And he feared that if he took steps to help the Jews or immigration, he would lose the support of Southern Democrats. And remember, if the Southern Democrats, who are now Republicans because of what Nixon was able to do with the so-called Southern strategy, but if the Southern Democrats suddenly joined with the Republicans, they could block a lot of overall New Deal efforts. There were, of course, disputes and debates within Roosevelt's cabinet on the issue of immigration. And two figures here stand out on the good guy side. Sorry, editorial comment. The first is Francis Perkins. Francis Perkins, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, is the only member of Roosevelt's cabinet to serve the entire time that Roosevelt was president. She is a remarkable woman, originally from Maine, Secretary of Labor. If you come to Washington, the Labor Department building is named for her. At the first cabinet meeting in the Roosevelt first term, Francis Perkins introduced ideas written by Felix Frankfurter on how to help Jews to immigrate into the country. She was immediately responded to by Undersecretary of State William Phillips, whom I mentioned before as a major anti-Semite, insisting that there is no need for a new policy right now. Perkins responded by saying that the United States traditionally admitted persecuted refugees. It is the basis of what this country was formed to do, going back to, and then she provided a history of America as the land of immigrants, beginning with the Pilgrims and whatever else she decided to go to. And Undersecretary Phillips said, there is no need now for additional people. This set the stage for continuing battles in the cabinet between Perkins and Secretary of Treasury Morgenthau on one side, and anti-Semites at State Department, whoever happened to show up, on the other. Now, as Secretary of State, as I mentioned before, Cordell Hull could have overruled the anti-Semites within the State Department. He chose not to, despite the fact that his wife was Jewish. And the reason was Cordell Hull thought that Roosevelt would win re-election in 1936, and that he would then be the Democratic nominee in 1940. Because at the time, no one figured that Roosevelt would run for a third term. Cordell Hull felt the only way he could get the nomination would be the support of Southern Democrats. Remember, he is from Tennessee, and therefore he was not about to buck the rest of the State Department. The key figure, again, on the good guy side, is Henry Morgenthau. Morgenthau and Perkins tried to do whatever they could. Roosevelt was not overly engaged in this issue. Now, he did express some concern about where Jews could go if they could get out. And the first step he took in this direction was to send cables to Britain to ask Britain to reverse their policy of limiting Jewish immigration into Palestine. In 1936, July, he instructed Secretary of State Hull to inform the British Prime Minister that the United States opposes the suspension of Jewish immigration to Palestine. Now, this is a very controversial set of cables. Supporters of Roosevelt say, he can't get them into the U.S. because of U.S. immigration policies. He's trying to help them get into Palestine. Isn't he wonderful? Opponents of Roosevelt take exactly the same cables and say, hey, he could have done something in the U.S. He's president, and he's saying Jews should get out but not come here. They should go there. So exactly the same piece of information, cables asking the British to let Jews into Palestine, is viewed by supporters of Roosevelt and opponents of Roosevelt as proof that they are right. Again, it's depending on how you want to view this. That said, the British responded by saying no. So Roosevelt also was concerned, obviously, particularly prior to his re-election in 1936, about his re-election in 1936. Once he was re-elected, and he ran against Alf Landon, and winds up winning all but 2 states. Alf Landon's daughter was Nancy Landon Cassavell, who wound up becoming a senator from Kansas. And Nancy wound up working in Senator Pearson's office. As Lauren mentioned, that was my first job on the Hill. And the first speech I wrote for Senator Pearson, Nancy typed. And so the ongoing joke that we have had ever since is that she began her career as my secretary. That said, you simply cannot find a more wonderful human being than Nancy Cassavell, but that's a different story. In any case, 1936, Roosevelt is re-elected. And once he is re-elected, he begins to focus more on the question of Jews than he had done in his first 4 years. And of course, also, the condition of Jews at that time continued to get worse. In November of 1937, just 2 weeks shortly after he was president for a few months, he contacts State Department and urges them to change their immigration policies to see if he can help Jews who are escaping from Germany. And again, in the 1936, 37, 38 period, Roosevelt does do more for immigration from Jews coming into this country. Another significant improvement took place at State Department when the anti-Semitic William Phelps is out and is replaced by Sumner Welles. Sumner Welles is very sympathetic to the Jews. He is probably the best from a pro-Jewish standpoint at the State Department during this entire period. Welles turns out to be quite significant, but unfortunately has a problem which we'll talk about in a little bit. On March 13, 1938, and again I'm giving you far too many dates, don't worry about it, there is no Blue Book exam after this. The Blue Book exam takes place after my talks on Vietnam, so you better show up at either Jupiter or Boca. On March 13, 1938, Hitler announces the Anschluss, the taking over of Austria by the Germans. This puts suddenly 200,000 Jews under his control, those living in Austria. The most famous, of course, being Sigmund Freud. Freud is able to get out, but most of the other Jews in Austria are trapped. And within one day after the Anschluss, over 3,000 Austrian Jews apply for immigration visas to the United States. Roosevelt then calls a cabinet meeting to discuss how you can increase the visa quota numbers for Germany and Austria. Vice President Nance, John Nance, responds that if Congress could vote secretly on immigration, they would overwhelmingly vote to halt all immigration. So don't even start talking about increases. After a while, Roosevelt comes up with an ingenious idea and claims credit for this himself. I don't know if he did it himself or got it from advisors, but he claimed credit. So let's give him credit. And that is to combine the very low number of immigrant quota statuses from Austria to the higher number from Germany, thereby enabling Austrian Jews to make up some of the unfilled quota numbers from Germany, thus increasing from 26,000 to over 27,000, the number able to come in, shared between Germany and Austria. In 1939, as a result of Roosevelt's efforts, was the only year that the German/Austrian quota was ever filled. That said, as an aside, by the beginning of World War II, there was an 11-year waiting list of German-Austrian Jews to come into the United States with over 300,000 unused visas, or visas that were not able to be used. On March 22, 1938, Roosevelt had a meeting with Undersecretary of State Welles, he's still up there, who is supportive, and Treasury Secretary Morgenthau. And he said to them, the United States should take a global lead in internationally facilitating and financing the immigration of, quote, political refugees, not Jews, political refugees. Now everyone knows what he meant, but he didn't use the word, from Germany and Austria. As a result, Roosevelt came up with what he very proudly called my proposal. My proposal was to call for an international conference to invite ultimately 32 countries from around the world to see if they will accept Jewish immigrants or political refugees, as he called them. When Governor Herbert Lehman, Jewish governor of New York, writes to Roosevelt about this, Roosevelt responds, quote, I wish we could have done more and done it sooner. But remember, the economy is still suffering through the Depression. He's having his ongoing struggles with Congress, particularly with the Southern Democrats. The country remains isolationist in sentiment, and there was growing anti-Semitism going on. That said, a conference is held from July 6 to July 14, 1938. It is held in Avion, on the French side of Lake Geneva. Of the 32 countries invited to attend, only one refused to show up, and that was Italy. I wonder why. Somehow Mussolini wasn't about to go to a conference to save the Jews. They arrived, by the way, Avion is naive spelled backwards. It really is. The next time you drink the water, of the 31 countries that were there, only one agreed to a quota to accept Jews, the Dominican Republic. And it agreed to accept 100,000 Jews. Ultimately, it did not accept that many. It accepted some. Immediately, both Mussolini and Hitler issued press releases. Goebbels, in particular, issues a press release saying the Avian Conference proves what we have been saying all along: no one wants the Jews. A month after, a couple of months later, on November 9, 1938, the Nazis attacked Jewish installations and synagogues throughout Germany and Austria in what is called Kristallnacht. I still remember talking to my stepfather about it. He wound up in the basement of the synagogue in the city where he was living at the time, Görlitz, and suddenly all the Jews were in the basement. They said, this is really stupid. They could get us all at once. And so he ran out and hid under a park bench and spent the night in hiding, and then ultimately after that was able, fortunately for him and me, to get out. The Nazis then came to the synagogue and set it on fire. However, they forgot to tell the Görlitz fire department, which put the fire out. So if you ever get to Görlitz, the burnt remains of the synagogue are still there. In protest to Kristallnacht, Roosevelt was the only, the United States, as a result of Roosevelt, was the only country to withdraw its ambassador from Germany in protest. Roosevelt stated that the news from Germany was, quote, scarcely believable in a modern civilized nation. That said, the outrage didn't translate into any real actions. Roosevelt then called Wells, Sumner Wells, he's still up there, and Morgenthau back to the White House to discuss if they could get Congress to appropriate $150 million over 4 years for refugee resettlement of political refugees. Again, not using the word Jews. And they both decided that, all three decided Congress would never pass that funding. Roosevelt then said, if we get them out, where could we settle them? And they thought maybe there's a place in Texas, and then they also suggested Alaska. The Alaskan Jews, and I've had the pleasure of speaking to the Jewish community up there, still to this day refer to themselves as the Frozen Chosen. Okay. If you can't take them into the United States, and only the Dominican Republic is saying they'll take them, and then they don't even live up to their pledge, where else can you get Jews into? Roosevelt again asks Sumner Wells to do a study, comes back and says Latin America. And the potential is quite strong in Latin America, and ultimately quite a few Jews, tens of thousands, too small a number, do wind up there. And the real potential, the most obvious potential to Roosevelt in Latin America was Cuba. By 1939, 6,000 German Jews were already in Cuba. By the way, Cuba's population at the time was a little over 4 million, so it's a drop in the bucket in the overall population. And most of these 6,000 had entered in the 1930s. The prospect for Jews entering Cuba comes to a head as a result of the episode in May of 1939, May and June of 1939, where the Cubans denied admission of a ship called the SS St. Louis. It's a remarkable story. It is the story, the book is called The Voyage of the Damned, written by Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witz. It tells the story of the ill-fated journey of the refugee ship, St. Louis, and was followed, came out in the mid-1970s by a major motion picture starring everybody. The story, if you haven't seen it, try to. It's a remarkable movie. The story is the following, and again, a lot of misinformation is out on this as well. The ship sailed from Hamburg on May 13, 1939, with 938 passengers, only one of whom was not a refugee. So 937 of the 938 were Jews who wanted to get out of Germany. The passengers thought that they had bought valid Cuban visas and landing permits from the German shipping line Hapag, which was only too delighted to sell passage and visas for a very expensive package deal. So they bought the tickets. The majority, if not all of the passengers, also had quota numbers to enter the United States, but they weren't quota numbers that would let them in soon. So they had quota numbers down the road, and they were mainly going to Cuba to hang out there until their number comes up so that they could then go to the United States. So they were viewing Cuba as a temporary place, or possibly long-term if necessary. Now, they bought landing certificates issued by the Cuban Director General of Immigration, a man by the name of Manuel Benitez. Now, he routinely sold these visas to enter Cuba for $150 each, and he pocketed most of the money himself, ultimately making millions in the sale of these visas. Unfortunately for him, just about the time when the St. Louis left, the president of Cuba, Federico Loredo Bru, finds out about this, fires the Minister Benitez, and says that those visas are no longer valid. The Jews who were on the ship had no way of knowing. They thought they paid for valid entry visas into Cuba at an inflated price. More than corruption and internal power struggles in Cuba were underway. Like the United States, Cuba was caught up in the Great Depression. Like the United States, there was an anti-immigration feeling. Can't let more people in, they're going to take our jobs. Like the United States, there was massive anti-Semitism. And 5 days before the St. Louis landed, there was the largest anti-Semitic rally in Cuban history, which was put together by Nazi saboteurs who were sent there to stir up trouble. 40,000 people demonstrated in Havana against any Jews coming to the country. Here are passengers on the St. Louis. The ship arrives in Havana Harbor on May 27 and is not allowed to dock in the usual place. 28 passengers are allowed to get off the ship. Those who had valid long-term visas that they had gotten separate from the ones I had just described. The other passengers were not allowed off, they stayed on board. The captain of the ship, Gustav Schrader, treated the passengers with enormous respect. He is ultimately honored at Yad Vashem as one of the righteous. He did everything he could to get the passengers off to no avail. By now, world media is paying attention to this, and everyone in every major newspaper is paying attention to what happens. Suddenly, 2 other ships arrive in Havana, and they are also turned away so that they leave. The St. Louis stayed. Pressure then mounts on the United States. As a result, the State Department tells Roosevelt not to pressure Cuba because it would violate the good neighbor policy, which again, for those of you who know about other factors, was Roosevelt's approach towards Latin America. And it would, quote, undermine U.S. standing in all of Latin America. That said, Roosevelt does ask the Cubans to take the passengers, and they refuse. On June 2nd, 1939, Cuba forces the ship to leave the harbor. Captain Schrader then takes the ship to the U.S. coast and comes within sight of Miami. Now, at this point, the Coast Guard shows up. And again, you hear 2 different stories. Critics of Roosevelt say that the Coast Guard showed up to prevent the ship from landing. Turned out not to be true. The Coast Guard is part of the Treasury Department, and Morgenthau had asked for the Coast Guard to be there to protect the ship in case of danger. Whatever it is, the Coast Guard is there, they're within sight of Miami, and they can't do anything. At this point, a number of members of Congress introduced resolutions demanding that Roosevelt not allow the ship to land. Basically saying that these people all have visas, and they would be jumping ahead of 300,000 other people who have quotas, and it would dismantle the quota system and would cause others in the future to do the same thing. Despite this press attention, on June 7th, the U.S. rules out any intervention. The Cubans gave their final no. So therefore, Captain Schrader then contacts the Canadians and asks Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King to provide sanctuaries. On June 9, the Canadians say no. Roosevelt then contacts European countries to see if the Europeans would accept the ship because they don't want to go back to Germany. And after negotiations, both by the Roosevelt administration and by Captain Schrader, he's able to take the ship back to Antwerp, not to Germany. and 4 nations agreed to take the passengers. Belgium takes 214, Britain takes 288, the Netherlands take 188, and the French take 224. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has done extensive research on what became of these people. Obviously, the 28 who got off in Cuba stayed in Cuba. All of those who went to Britain survived the war entirely. Sadly, 254 of the passengers died during the Holocaust, most of them at Auschwitz, Sobibor. The story of the St. Louis obviously overshadows that Roosevelt was able to arrange for about 7,000 other Jews to get into Cuba. Ultimately, the blame goes on the Cuban government, but Roosevelt should have been more forceful, could have been more forceful. Shame on him. He didn't handle this correctly, I think. It is also important to note that the United States quickly responded to what happened in May of 2009. That's what it says here. Whoever wrote this, on the 70th anniversary of the voyage, the Senate passes Resolution 111, acknowledging the refusal to accept the passengers on the ship. On September 24, 2012, I'm not making it up, the State Department invited 14 surviving passengers for a special ceremony where the Deputy Secretary of State stated, quote, "On behalf of the President and Secretary of State, I am honored to say to you what we should have said long ago, welcome." August 1940, there's an eerie replay of the St. Louis, which is not as well known. A Portuguese steamship named the Kwanzaa docks unexpectedly in Norfolk, Virginia with 86 German Jewish passengers. The story of the Kwanzaa is not as well known. Rabbi Wise and Eleanor Roosevelt appealed to Roosevelt for help on this, and the Assistant Secretary of State long sends in a memo to Roosevelt in opposition. Roosevelt then says the passengers on the Kwanzaa can stay in Norfolk and lets them in. By now the war had started, the situation is different, 86 people is not 900 people, and it didn't get as much publicity. Again, opponents of Roosevelt say this, supporters say, using the exact same story, say that. By late 1930s, anti-Semitism in the United States is on an increase beyond anything people could have recommended. Protests really boil over in the United States when Roosevelt appoints Frank Philip Heinberger to the Supreme Court. So at this point, people who are trying to deal with immigration come up with a new idea. Let's circumvent the immigration quotas and come up with something special, something different. Let's let children in. Who could oppose children? And so they built this because of the British allowing children in what was called the Kinderlift. About 10,000 children in the aftermath of Kristallnacht got into Britain on a Kinderlift. Secretary of State Francis Perkins, with the support of Eleanor Roosevelt, take a lead in trying to promote the idea of taking children in. The 2 members of Congress who take the lead, again, these are on the good guy side of the calendar, or the equation. Edith Norris Rogers takes the lead on the House side, and on the Senate side, New York Senator Robert Wagner. And they introduce a bill calling for 5,000 Jewish children to be allowed in separate from the quotas. The reaction was enormous. Over 2/3 of the letters reaching members of Congress opposed. Congress was flooded with telegrams and letters opposing the bill. One was to say it would be better to allow 5,000 old Jews because they won't multiply. Assistant Secretary of State George Messerschmitt sends to Roosevelt the State Department's official view expressing alarm at the concept. Ultimately, the bills by Rogers and Wagner don't even get voted on in a subcommittee or committee, let alone on the floor. Again, when I was at AIPAC, we used to use the Rogers-Wagner bill as proof of why you need to have a political presence in Washington. The war, of course, breaks out September 1939. For those of you preparing for the Blue Book exam, this was one of the dates you need to know. And of course, once the war breaks out, Breckinridge Long, remember him, who, Assistant Secretary of State in charge of immigration, calls for tightening of security checks, basically to cut off any Jews trying to get into the country. One of those, again, it's an individual story, who tries to get in at this time is Otto Frank. Otto Frank has a longtime friend from his childhood named Nathan Strauss, who was then head of the Federal Housing Authority, and he asks to get a visa for his family and is turned down. And you all know the rest of that story. It is significant that once the war breaks out, anti-Semitism in the United States really expands. And there are many who believe that Roosevelt's efforts to help Britain, the Lend-Lease program, the destroyer base program, the meetings with Churchill, are all designed to help the Jews. And this leads to tremendous anti-Semitic actions and statements in the United States. In particular, led by Charles Lindbergh, who gives a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, on September 11, 1941. Lindbergh is speaking on behalf of the America First Committee. He states, "Leaders of both British and Jewish races, for reasons that are not American, wish us to be involved in this war. Jews endanger America through their large ownership of our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. We cannot allow the Jews to run our country." That's direct quotes from Charles Lindbergh in his September 1941 speech in Des Moines. At about this time, Jews and Americans are learning more about what is happening in Europe. And we haven't focused on that enough in this talk. The Jewish Telegraph Agency had extensive foreign contacts and covered events as best as they could. July of 1941, the Jewish Yiddish dailies revealed that hundreds of thousands of Jewish civilians had been massacred by Nazi soldiers in Minsk, Brest-Litov, Lvov, and other places during the first German attacks against Russia. Mainstream media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Time Newsweek, carries articles and reports of escalating Nazi atrocities. And then events started to get worse. August 1941, Heinrich Himmler says that the SS should follow the German troops as they move eastward with the mission of murdering Jews and designated enemies. And as a result, they systematically shot Jews, men, women, and children, in areas that are taken over by the army. September 28, 1941, the SS, aided by Ukrainian auxiliary police, round up and kills 37,771 in an infamous ravine called Baba Yar, which was the largest mass murder to date. October 1941, the New York Times carries a report mentioning 10 to 15,000 Jews killed in Galicia. November 16, 1941, Joseph Goebbels gives a radio broadcast in which he outlines the need to exterminate Jews, explaining that Jews did not deserve to survive on this earth. That speech is covered in every major American paper. The next turning point for us is, of course, September 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor is attacked. Now, once Pearl Harbor is attacked, a large percentage, if not a majority of Americans wanted to go to war only against Japan, not Germany. And the reason we were able to go to war against Germany was that Hitler declared war against the United States. We did not declare war against Germany first. Shortly after that, on January 20th, 1942, at a villa in the outskirts of Berlin called Wannsee. It's a lovely villa. If you've ever been to Berlin, you ought to go. If you haven't been, you ought to go. If you've been, you will know what I talk about. While hundreds of thousands were killed, obviously, before Wannsee, at the Wannsee Conference, which was led by Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, they put together the plan to bring Jews to the East in order to systematically murder them. This is essentially January 20th, 1942, the, put in words in quote, official start of the Holocaust. Obviously, the hundreds of thousands who were killed before are not comforted by that fact. If you want to see a really, really scary movie, 2001 movie called Conspiracy. Kenneth Branagh plays Heydrich and Stanley Tucci played Eichmann. It's a remarkable movie. And again, if you have time. For our purposes, this raises the question of when did the United States government know about this, and when was it officially acknowledged? Beyond the press reports, what did Roosevelt know about the mass killings, and when did he know it? Now, the mainstream press, of course, could not have known what was done in secret at Wannsee. I mean, there's just no way to have known that. However, in March of 1942, just weeks after Wannsee, the New York Times reported that the Nazis had massacred 250,000 Jews in Ukraine alone. April of 1942, the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland sends a report that, quote, Germany no longer persecutes Jews, it is systematically exterminating them. May 1942, the New York Times reports that Nazi gunners killed over 100,000 Jews in the Baltic states. June 1942, New York Times reports 700,000 Polish Jews had been murdered. As a result, the State Department finally asks its embassies in Europe to explain what is going on. The minister from Sweden sends a report that 284,000 Jews had been executed by the Nazis in areas wrested from the Russians. As a result of these public statements, Jewish groups organize a series of rallies and protests. July 21, 1942, 20,000 people crowd into Madison Square Garden, where they hear Rabbi Wise, New York Governor Lehman, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. Roosevelt sends a message, quote, the American people will hold the perpetrators of these crimes to strict accountability in a day of reckoning which will surely come. The crowd bursts into ovations. It is the first time that Roosevelt uses the word Jews in his statement, and also uses the word extermination. Because before that he had talked about political, and he had talked about crimes against humanity. He also articulates the main theme that he and the administration will use for the rest of the war. That the goal of the United States is to defeat the Nazis, and that this is the best way to help the Jews. There is no other way. In Roosevelt's mind, the war, the Second World War, was not a war to end the Holocaust, it was a war to defeat the Nazis. In his mind, these are lumped. Now obviously, those who are critical of Roosevelt say he should have done more on the Holocaust, and the supporters will say the only thing he could have done was to defeat the Nazis. This becomes the central theme. You will hear it a lot as we go forward. The key question, of course, is when did Roosevelt administration definitively actually know what was going on? The answer to that is a result, when were they aware of, in quotes again, the final solution? The answer comes as a result of the famous telegram that was sent by Dr. Gerhard Riegner. Riegner is a representative of the World Jewish Congress in Switzerland. He learns from a unnamed German industrialist of the plans to kill between 3.5 million to 4 million Jews in the eastern part of Europe. He takes this information to the American consulate in Switzerland, in Geneva, on August 8th. And pay attention to the dates. They're not important in the big picture, but in the small picture they are. August 8th, Riegner goes to the American consulate in Geneva and tells them. The information is then telegraphed from the consulate in Switzerland to the State Department on August 11th, 3 days later. The State Department, who receives it, research and say that, the quote, this is, quote, totally unbelievable. Jews who might be deported are being sent elsewhere for, quote, labor purposes. State Department says this is a war rumor and fantastic at this. Riegner sends his telegram also to a member of the British Parliament by the name of Samuel Sidney Silverman. Sidney Silverman sends it to Rabbi Wise, who receives it on August 28. Rabbi Wise then sends the telegram to Sumner Wells. Sumner Wells says, come to Washington and let's discuss this. Wise shows up in Washington on September 2nd, so almost to the day, a month later after the cable was sent. And Wise does not know, he's the number 2 at the State Department, that State Department has already gotten this information 3 weeks earlier, and says it simply can't be true, but we will investigate. Unrelated to this investigation, and I'll interrupt it for a second, on October 7, Roosevelt declares that the Allies would punish war criminals when the hostilities ceased, and that the Allies would convene a War Crimes Commission, and indicated his belief that Nazi war crimes were ongoing. No mention made of extermination. Now remember, at this point, the United States had no presence, military presence, in the areas where the Nazis were in control. This is a tough time for Roosevelt, October 1942. We're not doing well in the war. The Nazis are right outside of Stalingrad. Rommel is taking control of North Africa. If he had been successful, he would have gained the Suez Canal and Palestine, where there were 500,000–600,000 Jews who could have been in dire straits as well. The war in the Pacific is not going well, and Roosevelt's aim is to win the war. So without question, the turning the tide of the war is dominant on his thoughts patterns, not the Holocaust. Everything changes on November 24, 1942. This is another one of the key dates. November 24, 1942. Wells calls up Rabbi Wise and says, come to Washington. The Riegner telegram is correct. Wise shows up in Washington, and Wells says, I'm not in a position for State Department to issue a statement saying that the Riegner telegram is correct, but you can. Remarkable. And so a private citizen holds a press conference on November 24, 1942, says sources confirmed by the State Department revealed an extermination campaign aimed at wiping out the Jews of Europe in areas controlled by the Nazis, and that as many as 2 million Jews had already been killed. That's a statement by Wise saying, this is I'm allowed to say this by State, but State didn't say it. Rather remarkable. The story winds up on page 10 of the New York Times, page 6 of the Washington Post, and page 2 of the LA Times. If State Department had said it, it probably would have gotten more coverage. So November 24, State Department officially acknowledges the Holocaust. So we now know exactly the date. November 1942 is not a particularly good date for Roosevelt and his administration. In the congressional elections of November 1942, the House, the Republicans win an additional 47 seats in the House and 9 in the Senate. Thus, Republicans with conservative Democrats can control the entire Congress. On December 2nd, 1942, a day of mourning and prayer is observed in 29 countries and in the United States. The biggest is in New York, featuring Mayor LaGuardia and Rabbi Wise. As a result of this conference or protest, on December 8, 1942, Roosevelt agrees for his only meeting with Jewish groups throughout this war. Rabbi Wise comes and he meets with Wise periodically, but this is the first time Wise is accompanied by other Jewish leaders in the White House. And Wise tells Roosevelt, unless action is taken immediately, there will be no Jews left in Europe. All of the Jews are doomed. Roosevelt tells the Jewish delegates he's deeply troubled by the fate of the Jews, but this could not override the bigger cause of winning the war. Again, we will see this over and over again. He asks the Jewish leaders, what would you do if you were me to help the Jews? And none of them had an answer. None of them knew. Because remember, the Jews we're now talking about are in areas controlled by the Nazis where there are no American or Allied troops available. Roosevelt's response is significant because he does say he is now fully aware of the extermination program. The State Department, led by a guy named R. Borden Weems, who is, quote, the State Department specialist on Jewish issues, says that we should tone down any statement we make as a result of this. and says that the best that the U.S. government should say is war criminals will be punished. Roosevelt instead goes a different direction and contacts the British, and together with the British, they issue a statement on December 17, criticizing German government's intention to eliminate the Jewish people in Europe. It is the strongest condemnation by the Allies during the entire World War. So Roosevelt and Britain, December 1942, condemned the extermination by the by the Nazis of the Jews. At this point, or around this point, more hardline Jews feel that Rabbi Wise and the more official Jewish leaders are ineffective, that they are not doing a good enough job. And a new group is formed called Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People. They are revisionist Zionists, more in line with Jabotinsky and Begin, if you're looking at it in the Palestinian context, whereas Wise would be more aligned with the Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir faction. These are more hardline Jews. They are led by Hillel Kook, who in America uses an American name of Peter Bergson, and by the writer Ben Hecht. They put together a play called We Will Never Die. It's performed at Madison Square Garden. It's performed at DAR Hall in Washington. Eleanor Roosevelt shows up. They want the Roosevelt administration to take stronger and more hardline positions. Then they decide that they're going to have their protest and come to see the president as well. On October 1943, a group of Orthodox rabbis, more hardline Jews, more using today's terminology, I'll put the word in quotes, right-wing Jews, come to Washington, and immediately Rabbi Wise tells all Jewish members of Congress sign a statement saying that members of Congress and the Roosevelt administration should not meet with them. Congressman Saul Bloom, Democrat of New York, says that these, quote, these bearded, undignified people look un-American. This underscores the fact that Jews will fight with Jews no matter what else is going on. Jews continue to try and find a role for themselves. Roosevelt then decides it's time for another international conference. And he calls this to take place in Bermuda in 1943 in April. The goal of the conference is to see whether or not they can save Jews from Bulgaria and Romania. They arrive in Bermuda, and immediately the discussion, which should have been on relief, humanitarian assistance, and places for Jews to go, boils into nothing. And the Bermuda conference is a total failure. But it was an attempt again by Roosevelt to try and do something. In August of 1943, Morgenthau says, we can evacuate 70,000 Jews from Romania if we can get an appropriation of 170,000. Undersecretary of State Wells says he will push it within the State Department and they will lobby the conference. And then it turns out that Wells has a sexual problem. Now that could never happen in our lifetime. But he is outed as a homosexual and is forced out of the State Department because of his sexual preferences and his drinking habits. He was, as I mentioned, the best pro-Jewish at the State Department. Roosevelt tells his successor, Edward Stettinius, that America should do as much as it can for the Jews, but not much is done. A hearing is then held in the Congress on what is being done for the Jews. Breckinridge Long testifies on behalf of the State Department. He explains that it has been difficult to deal with the quotas, but the State Department has been doing everything possible to help Jews get out. And in fact, the State Department had arranged for 583,000 refugees to enter the United States since 1933. His number was correct, except that it was 2.5 times the actual number. He basically lied to the State Department, to the Congress. Representative Emanuel Seller said, your numbers are 2.5 times wrong. You are lying. You must resign. Long refused. At a cabinet meeting after this, Morgenthau tells Long, you are an anti-Semite. Long does not respond. Morgenthau now figures it's time to do something serious. And he asks, remember he is the Secretary of Treasury, He asks his general counsel, Josiah Dubois Jr., to draft a report entitled, "Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of Jews." And the Treasury Department, under Dubois, finishes their report on Christmas Day, 1943. It charges the State Department with creating bottlenecks granting visas, and detailed how state had obstructed presidentially approved rescue plans. It describes how the State Department had suppressed information from Switzerland on Nazi killing and then sought to cover it up. It focused on 3 separate areas of State Department malfeasance: obstructing the rescue, suppressing the news, and undermining attempts by private organizations to help the Jews. Overwhelming evidence that State Department was guilty. This report was slightly toned down and it was presented to Roosevelt in January of 1944, with it titled no longer being Report to the Secretary on Acquiescence of the Murder of the Jews to Report to the President. Roosevelt reads it and says, "We must do something. What can we do?" Morgenthau says, "Create an agency for relief to help the Jews." Roosevelt says yes. And Executive Order 9417, issued January 22nd, 1944, they established the War Refugee Board, empowering it to take all measures within the power to rescue the victims of enemy oppression who are in imminent danger of death. In other words, to finally start doing something positive to rescue Jews. As soon as this is made public, it arouses opposition from all of the sources you can imagine. Congressman Noah Mason, a Republican of Illinois, the ranking Republican on the Immigration Committee, called the War Refugee Board unconstitutional, claimed it would lead to unrestricted immigration. He added that the U.S. had already allowed 600,000, double the wrong number that Long had used, in, and that's enough. The military said that trying to help refugees would divert them from their effort to try and win the war. That said, the War Refugee Board is the main humanitarian effort, and ultimately it is credited with saving over 200,000 Jewish lives in Europe, beginning in 1944 on. Mainly in Hungary, where a War Refugee Board agent, whose name you probably have never heard, Raoul Wallenberg, who was sent to Budapest by the War Refugee Board to save Jews, personally saves over 100,000. And again, that's a topic for a different talk. The War Refugee Board, clearly, by this point, the administration is aware and trying to do something. This brings us to the last topic. We've gone on way too long. The last topic for today, and that is the question of should the United States or the Allies have bombed Auschwitz? Again, it's the bookend, the St. Louis and Auschwitz. Obviously, current leaders talk about it all the time. In 1998, Netanyahu spoke at Auschwitz and said that the Allies' failure to bomb Auschwitz because the Jews did not have a state to protect them. If there had been in Israel, there would have been a bombing of Auschwitz. 2012, Bibi cited America's failure to bomb Auschwitz as a justification for a preemptive strike against Iran. April 22nd, at the opening of the Holocaust Museum, President Clinton delivered the keynote address. He spoke of the death of millions whom our nations did not, would not, or could not save. Before the war even started, doors to liberty were shut, and even after the United States and Allies attacked Germany, rail lines to the camps and the camps themselves were left undisturbed. President Bush, in 2008, visited the Holocaust Museum at Yad Vashem, and with tears in his eyes declared the United States should have bombed Auschwitz. President Obama, when he spoke at the Holocaust Museum in 2012, made the same points. Essentially, this is Auschwitz, a photo taken from American planes. So the question is, if we flew over it and could take pictures, when did we know and could we have bombed it? We basically knew what was going on in Auschwitz beginning on April 7, 1944, when 2 Jewish prisoners were able to escape and let their word out. In addition, Jan Karski, who was then in Washington, was able to get his message to the United States. The story was leaked out on May 10, 1944. The New York Times carried the story that Hungarian Jews were being sent there and gave a figure of 80,000 that had already been killed in Auschwitz. Next, we knew about it. When were we in a position to bomb? Now, bombing isn't just going there, dropping bombs, and you need to come back. And did we have the capability of flying there without refueling? Because certainly the Russians weren't going to let us refuel in that area. The answer is we certainly couldn't do it until we had bombing missions as close as Italy. And so we're now looking at late spring, early summer, maybe midsummer of 1944. Here's another picture that we took at the time. That said, the bombs that we had were not precision bombing. And bombing the rail lines, we would never have been able to hit rail lines. And even if you hit a rail line, you rebuild railroads pretty quickly. Bridges would have been better. Auschwitz itself, it would have been extremely difficult. That said, no effort was made to do it. Why was no effort made to do it? Requests by the War Refugee Board were sent to the Defense Department, where Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy received them. And he said that destroying rail lines would have no effect other than to delay matters for a few days. It would have meant that planes would have been diverted from other theaters of operation, and we must win the war. It is more important. On June 26, 1944, McCloy issued the official response indicating disapproval of the proposed operation, stating no other action is necessary. Major General Thomas Handy added the following: the most effective relief to the victims of enemy persecution is the early defeat of the Axis, an undertaking to which we must devote every resource at our disposal. Essentially, 6 or 7 more requests were made of the Defense Department, all turned down. Chaim Weizmann was in England. He asked the British to do and was also turned down. This brings us to the question, was Roosevelt involved in this? The answer is, in all likelihood, no. It is probably not likely that he was even aware that the question was raised, and he took no position on individual bombing targets. So we're now at the final part of the talk. I'm sure you all want to get out and enjoy the weather. I've gone on far too long, so for which I apologize. But the answer is, there is no good answer. For those of you who are expecting me to say, Roosevelt was terrible, Roosevelt was wonderful, no. And not only that, we're looking at a long period of time. We're looking at 13 years of Roosevelt's presidency, and you really have to look at it, one way of looking at it is to divide it by the terms. During Roosevelt's first term, he did little to assist the Jews in Germany. He put the Depression, recovery, reform well ahead of everything else. He saw the anti-Semitism, the anti-immigration feelings, the nativism in this country, and didn't think he could do anything. That said, he should have done more. He should have spoken out more. Would it have helped? I don't know. His actions certainly changed after he was reelected in 1936. He merged the quotas between Germany and Austria to help Austrian Jews who otherwise couldn't have gotten out. Between 1936 and 39, 83,000 German and Austrian Jews get in, compared with 18,000 the 4 years earlier. So yes, efforts were made, and they worked. He set up an approach to try and get international leaders to help, which led to the Avion Conference. And obviously, international leaders did not go with this. He withdrew the American ambassador after Kristallnacht. He got Latin American countries to take Jews. Cuba took in an additional 5,000, Bolivia 20,000, Brazil 10,000. He didn't fight hard enough, or if at all, for the Wagner-Rogers bill to take in children. He encouraged the British to take in Jews into Palestine, but that wasn't helping Jews get into America. And he didn't want to undermine the British because he needed them in the war effort. He could have done more on the St. Louis, but on the other hand, it was complicated. And with congressional opposition and the State Department opposition, hard to know what Roosevelt could have done. He should have gotten rid of Breckinridge long. He didn't. Third term is dominated by the war, and his effort is win the war. There's very little you can do for the Jews in areas where you don't have soldiers. What are you going to do about this? He calls for a conference to be held on this issue in Bermuda. It turns out to be a failure. He certainly issues the statement together with Britain in December of 1942 condemning this, but it didn't lead to very many actions. He creates, together with Morgenthau, the War Refugee Board, which does save 200,000 Jewish lives. And obviously, that is remarkable. I had long discussions about this with some of those who were saved, including Tom Lantos, who became a congressman from California, who was one of those whose lives was saved. Auschwitz, yes, we should have bombed Auschwitz. Was it Roosevelt's fault that we didn't? Probably not, but it was the Defense Department's fault. Would it have made a difference? Hard to know. The final verdict is very difficult on this. So where do we come up with a final verdict on all this? As I said at the beginning, it's up to each one of you. I can't give you a proper answer other than providing the information, so I leave that for all of you to decide. Again, I've gone on far too long, and I'd be glad to answer questions.